Welcome, everyone, to another Reuters Newsmaker. I'm Axel Threlfall in London. Welcome also to those joining as part of the Reuters Events Energy Transition series. I am delighted to have Frans Timmermans as my guest today. Executive Vice President Timmermans leads the European Commission's work on the European Green Deal and its first European climate law. Now, this is, of course, a timely conversation given that the EU Leaders Summit is just wrapping up in Brussels. Climate was on the agenda, more specifically an upgrade to the existing 2030 targets on greenhouse gas emissions. Frans, thanks very much indeed for talking with us. And it's there, of course, that I want to start. As expected, no agreement this time round on the 2030 target. They say they'll look at this again in December. More consultation has been agreed upon to assess specific impact on countries. Are you disappointed? Does this just inject more wiggle room into the process, more reason for delay and postponement?
No, not really. There's no surprise here. This is what we expected, and I think it's a good sign that there was a consensual first round of discussions on this. And then the Council itself, not the European Council, but the Council can now look at the matter, and then we might be able to prepare a solution or a conclusion by December. And that has been our wish from the start. So I'm not disappointed at all. I think this is exactly the way we would like things to be.
Obviously, the Commission now has to whip up some pretty detailed analysis of what a 55% goal would mean for each country. They've got to do that by December. Is that realistic? Is that doable? What's the likelihood of getting something agreed in December?
What we're going to do is to elaborate on the impact assessment we've done for the EU as a whole, and then to the best of our abilities, we will see what this means for the different sectors. Obviously, we're going to propose concrete legislation on the energy, on renewable energy, on the emissions trading system by June next year, and then people will know exactly what it means for them. But to the best of our abilities, with everything we have, we'll try and specify what this means for individual member states between now and then.
And do you think, Frans, that has placated some of the more resistant members, Poland, for example?
Well, I think I see quite a sea change also in Central and Eastern Europe in terms of the climate crisis. A fast-growing understanding that this has implications for everyone, that there's no future in coal, and that we need to help countries transit out of coal into sustainable energy. And why is it speeding up? I think because they understand there's a direct link between this transition and Next Generation EU and the multi-annual budget that will help us come out of the crisis, hopefully, in the next couple of years. So if they delay and don't link it with the financial possibilities offered by Next Generation EU, they might lose out in terms of the support they can get from Europe. So I think that is also speeding up their own thinking. Apart from the fact that economic realities are also sinking in, there's simply no economic future in coal.
Yeah. So you think the dial has moved at this summit? And again, what do you think, Frans, is the likelihood of an agreement in December?
Well, I'm optimistic that we can reach an agreement in December, but there's also externalities we need to think about. The way we're going to handle the pandemic now, and the way things are going to develop over the next couple of weeks, of course, are also going to be of influence on other discussions. And also, if co-legislators, Parliament and Council, can reach an agreement on Next Generation EU and the MFF, that will also speed up things. So I hope we can look forward to an agreement very soon, and then we can go to ratification in all member states of the agreement, and then we can move along. And then, of course, the plans they're submitting will all also integrate plans to decarbonize and to change the energy mix.
Yeah. Given that we're, and I'll come on to this in more detail in just a moment, but given that the Green Deal is being called by many now as a lifeline out of this crisis, in the scheme of things, at the EU27 meeting that's just happened, where in the priority list is climate for these countries now, for these leaders now? Is it high enough? And there was a little bit of exasperation expressed by Charles Michel earlier. What's your call? Is it high enough?
Well, I have to say, I am encouraged by the fact that, what are people worrying about in Europe? They're worrying about their health. They're worrying about their jobs. They're worrying about their loved ones. And still, with all these worries that are on the top of their list, their worries about the climate crisis have not disappeared or even diminished, is what we see when we analyze this. So I think the position of the leaders is a reflection of what's happening in society. Our citizens understand this is a crisis we need to tackle as well, and we can only tackle it at the European level. So that's, I think, helping leaders understand that they have an opportunity here that also helps them get support from the populations. And I think they all have seen the fact that Europe was able to reach a consensus on how to recover from this, at showing solidarity at the EU level, has increased the support in our member states for the European Union.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, and as you just alluded to, we hear a lot about the crisis as a catalyst as well for climate recovery. Do we need to take a breath here, or do you think this really is our chance now? 30% of the 750 billion to speed up this action. Is this your time now? And if we miss this window and we miss making the most of these funds, we've really missed a good chance, the best chance.
Well, let me share two thoughts with you. First of all, how I dealt with the private sector before the pandemic. Positive reactions, especially those in the private sector who've been working on this for many years. Others saying, okay, it's good. We might be part of this. We probably will be at some point in the future, but we're on the fence because it's going well and we're making a lot of profits, etc. Now, the pandemic has changed that. Now they're all on the same page. Okay, we know we need to restructure in many sectors. We know this is going to be extremely difficult. And we know we risk creating a lot of stranded assets if we put the money in the wrong things. So let's put the money in a recovery that is that leads us to carbon neutrality and climate neutrality, because that's where the future is. I think this line of thought is really dominant in the private sector, and that's helping politicians also go in the same direction. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, personally, I became a grandfather only a couple of months ago when I still could hold my grandson, which now sadly is not possible. I saw this little man, and I thought, what's the world going to be like in 20 years' time? And much of what's going to be happening in 20 years' time will be determined by what we do in the next couple of years. Yeah. And that is huge responsibility this generation has for future generations.
Oh, look, I'm with you on that story. I mean, I feel the same when I look at my, in the eyes of my kids right now. But the job is to convince the leaders of Poland, of the Czech Republic, of Hungary right now, and that's the battle. And I seem to get, Frans, from you that the business is being more receptive than the policy arena. Is that right?
Yeah, because of what's happened in the last 15 years, you must have seen this. Politics has become more and more short-term. Because we lost so much confidence of our citizens that we've become more and more short-term, because citizens are not easily convinced that we are doing the right thing for the long term. So we become more and more short-term. Whereas business, especially big corporations, have to be long-term. They have to think in terms of decades for their survival. So they've seen the light earlier than many politicians, and that helps now bring politicians on board. But if I look at Central and Eastern Europe, I mean, I am so encouraged by what's happening there in terms of the population. People are demanding better air quality. People are demanding an improvement of their of standards of living. And look at the projects they have for decarbonizing, for bringing sustainable energy to renewable energy to their energy mix, for renovating the housing, because so much of the housing is still heated with coal or wood even, that renovating the housing there would have a huge plus on reducing emissions, and will increase the quality of living, and will reduce the risk of energy poverty. So if we move on this quickly with the funds available now, then I think those politicians in power in those member states could create a positive feeling about what they're doing with their population.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the creation of jobs as a part of this renovation wave is a massive part of this as well, right?
Absolutely. These jobs cannot be delocalized, and they address that part of the private sector that is not always looking long term. You know, if you have a small or medium-sized enterprise, you're thinking about next month. You're thinking how you're going to pay the people who work for you. You're thinking how you're going to keep your shop open, not about what's happening in 10 or 20 years. So if you can give SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, a perspective, you're going to be part of this renovation wave. You're going to have access to good loans from the European Investment Bank or other banks who want to be part of this renovation wave. We're going to give you the technology and the tools to get there. We're going to make sure that citizens feel more secure in taking out a loan to renovate their homes, because you're going to provide them with all the technical details, and we're going to help you to be in that position. You know, this is a huge positive proposition for SMEs across the European Union.
You know, we often hear, the EU often talks about changes to the bloc's energy mix, sustainable investment, efforts by businesses, as we've been talking about for the last few minutes. What about us as individuals, though, Frans? How are you asking European citizens to change their behaviour, to do their bit to fight climate change? What specifically are we seeing here?
Well, my experience in the past couple of years with single-use plastics, this was we could translate the problem of plastic pollution to you as an individual can do something about this. And that's why we got legislation through in a record time of 8 months, because people wanted to do. So you need to show how people can be part of this. Because otherwise, you know, I don't fear climate denial anymore. I fear climate desperation. People saying, why should we do something? It's lost anyway. No, it isn't. And we can do, you can renovate your house. You can change your transport needs and the way you move by taking the train a bit more often, by better public transport, by electric mobility. You can look at your consumption patterns. Do you the food you eat? If we provide good information on that food, people want to live healthier lives. People want to be part of this movement, but we as legislators need to lower the threshold. We need to make it easier for people to be part of that.
Yeah, plenty of questions coming through, and I will try and weave these in. And there's carbon pricing is one area, and I'm going to come to that, by the way, whoever's sending those questions through. But a question, and we've heard this before, but countless examples of corporations, France, thwarting the actions of climate. You know, can we really trust, goes the question, the actions of companies like Shell and BP to put the planet and people above profits? How's that conversation changing?
Well, I honestly believe, of course, we have to, it's good to trust, but it's better to verify. I do believe there is a genuine movement of these oil companies who understand that in the long run, there's no future in their present economic model. So they want to make that shift. And of course, they have huge capital, access to capital, and the possibility to make a shift if they start early enough. So I think there is a genuine undertaking in many of these companies, sadly not all of them, but you mentioned a couple where I think it is a genuine undertaking to make this transition. But we have to provide them with the right incentives in terms of legislation, in terms of predictability, in terms of providing for better conditions for a sustainable energy grid, in terms of moving towards hydrogen, in terms of providing for better accessibility to electric mobility. All these things will also help these oil companies understand that they need to invest in other things than oil.
Speaking of hydrogen and technology, how worried are you that innovation, that new technology, that entrepreneurships will suffer in this new environment, this low capex environment, this tough economic environment?
Well, of course, we have the challenge of this hugely intrusive pandemic that led to a huge problem for our economy, and it's not over yet. And then we have the climate crisis, we have a biodiversity crisis, and we're in the middle of an industrial revolution. So these are all tectonic changes, and they are going to affect every economic structure, every industry. You see it happening already. And I think the task of legislators, of politicians, is to provide the right circumstances so that these tectonic changes don't lead to huge injustices in our society. Because we've seen in earlier industrial revolutions, there is a propensity to create a small group of huge winners and a huge group of people who lose out on this. So we have to prevent this. We have to make sure politics is about, in the end of the day, politics is about only one thing: redistribution. You can boil it down to that. And we need to make sure we provide the right legal and political framework so that redistribution in this tectonic shift leads to nobody being left behind.
A question comes in, specifically on this funding of technology. Is the EU doing enough to prioritize and sufficiently fund climate-related research and innovation? They're clearly thinking about Horizon Europe, the main research and innovation funding program that's going to be cut. You as executive vice president, how can you leverage the Green Deal so that climate-related R&D is better positioned to get the kind of funding it needs?
Well, I still hope there's going to be an agreement with the European Parliament that funding for Horizon and other programs is going to improve. I think cutting funding for research and development is being penny wise and pound foolish. So what we need to do now, the commitment that 37% of the expenditure of the projects in Next Generation EU should be climate related, should help us also to make sure that we have more funding for the further development of technologies. We're not talking about completely new technologies that have to be invented. We're talking about bringing a number of technologies to the market. Let me give you one example. Between now and 5, 6, 7 years from now, we will have commercially competitive green steel in Europe, steel made with hydrogen. So the technology is there. It's just not good enough for the market yet. So we need to invest so that it becomes good enough for the market. And that will happen in a number of years' time. And I can give you many examples on batteries, on hydrogen, on mobility, on 5G, where it's more bringing things together so that technologies that are there are upscaled so that they can be applied in the market as soon as possible.
Okay. I want to step back and talk a little bit more about global effort, collaboration, solidarity, whatever you want to call it. We can't do this on our own has become a pretty familiar refrain from you, Frans, and from the EU. But we are seeing movement in China. We're awaiting the outcome of the US election as well, which could change things. Will you still be saying that from now? Will that still be a refrain a year from now?
Well, it's inevitable because, we're only responsible as Europeans for about 9% of global emissions. If we really want Paris to be a success, the rest of the industrialized world will have to make comparable efforts. And the part of the world that's still industrializing will have to be supported, both in terms of bringing development there, but also in helping them with the adaptation to climate change and the mitigation of the consequences of climate change. So this is going to be a big movement. We have to make sure by showing leadership that we take our responsibility, but we also have to make sure that other parts of the industrialized world don't hide behind industrializing countries and avoid doing what they need to do. And we have a short window of opportunity between now and the summit in Glasgow. And I hope by Glasgow, we have all the industrialized world on board. The announcement by China a couple of weeks ago in the UN of decarbonizing by 2060 is extremely helpful. We will have to wait for the plans of the new administration in the US, whatever the outcome of the election. But I'm sure that working together, we can move in that direction. We have, as Europeans, a special responsibility vis-a-vis Africa. Things are really changing quickly in Africa in a positive way. The fact that South Africa, with its coal industry, has now committed to decarbonize by 2050 is really a sea change. It's something that has a huge impact on the thinking in Africa about climate change.
How much of a difference would it make for the EU to have the US as an ally on climate action?
I think on several levels, because we already have very strong allies in almost all of corporate America, in many of the states, in many of the cities. it would just make things a lot smoother if the same would apply on the federal level. And the second element is a very important element, I believe. China was part of the success in Paris, and China's very proud that they were part of creating a success in Paris. Now, this, if the United States were to move again on Paris in a positive way, I'm very, very convinced of the fact that China will not want to be seen as lagging behind, and China will then move as well. And then if the United States, China, and the European Union move in that direction, then I believe we can take the rest of the world along with us as well.
All right. So that sort of global climate race, that showdown, if you like, is one reason to be optimistic or hope for that. But let me ask you specifically on the US. Are there specific EU-US climate collaborations that you could hope for? You know, both countries having carbon border cost policies, for example, stuff like that. Could we see that?
Well, I think if you want me, if I could mention one area where I believe this cooperation could be very successful, it's in the emissions trading system. The European emissions trading system has proven itself. It even was resilient in the pandemic. The price is going up, which is a good signal. We have to expand it to other areas. We have to tighten it at some areas. And I know that China is going to move ahead with its own ETS system. And I know that if we could get the United States, where corporate America is very interested, some of the states, look at California and other states, are also very interested. If we could move together on this, I think this is one of the areas where our cooperation could really yield huge results.
And you mentioned,
putting a price on carbon is what we need to do.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned the China system that they're going to launch. Has the European Commission been engaged at all with China on developing that scheme? And could you envisage linking and trading between the two systems?
Well, we've been consistently talking to the Chinese about the systems, about other things we do, about coal-fired power stations, about topping out the emissions. And these conversations are always very intensive. We share what we know, we share what works for us, and sometimes you see some of that coming back in the Chinese model. Sometimes they have their own way of doing things. But the fact of the matter is that with all the contentious issues we have with China, this is an area where I believe our cooperation is constructive.
By the way, to the viewers, keep sending questions through for Frans, and I'll try and get them to him as we go along. Staying with China, I mean, of course, they announced their carbon neutrality pledge a week after meeting with EU leaders. The EU has said they wanted to see more ambition for China. Can the EU take some credit for what happened in China, do you think?
Well, China's a very big place, and I think we should be careful to claim anything. But the reality is, since I took up this portfolio, I've seen very, very tough talks with the Chinese on trade, on human rights, on international politics, and they're being very tough with us as well. And at the same time, we've been very clear on climate change, and there's been some ups and downs. There was a bit of reluctance at the beginning, and then they step by step came back to this, and the conversations were more constructive. And then Xi Jinping clearly himself took a decision, yes, we're going into that direction. And that, of course, in a system like the Chinese, creates a positive dynamic. And I'm really hopeful that we can continue working with them on this.
How important is it to get Russia to the table? What's the EU's position now regarding Russia and its resistance, its general resistance to transition?
Well, I think Russia, of course, with its dependency on fossil fuels, on oil and gas, is a particularly tough nut to crack. Also because they have not, over the years, put much effort in diversifying their economy and looking for other options. At the same time, if you look at places like companies like Gazprom, they are thinking about hydrogen in a way that could be constructive, because we want to create a scale, a remarkable scale for green hydrogen as soon as we can. But there will be elements of what we call blue hydrogen as well. And if Russia and Gazprom would be able to decarbonize natural gas and then turn that into hydrogen, as a transitional method of going towards carbon-free emissions, that could work, and it could also work for them, because the relationship we have with Russia, it's very complicated for many reasons that I don't need to elaborate. But I think sometimes in Europe, people think we depend on them because they deliver the gas to Europe. But I would rather see it the other way around. They depend on us because we're buying their gas. And our economy is more diversified. Our dependency on fossil fuels will diminish. Our position vis-a-vis Russia will then become stronger and stronger. And they know this perfectly well, and they're trying to get the most out of the present situation that they can.
But I'm right in saying that it's not just Russia who's been riled by the carbon border policy and what it means, right? I mean, what are the other what reactions have you had from other countries?
Well, I mean, in general, you should look which areas will be affected by carbon border adjustment logically, which sectors logically, where do we make advances and others don't? Where is our carbon footprint diminishing and others don't? It's areas such as steel, cement, you can call a number of others, and then you look at which are the countries exporting many of those commodities to the European Union. China, Turkey, the United States. So, I mean, it's not that difficult to predict where the resistance will be coming from. But I think we can build a case very clearly in saying, look, we've signed the Paris Agreement. That has consequences. We need to decarbonize certain of these sectors. We're taking the right steps. And that if we take the right steps, we're absolutely in our right when we protect our industry that does that and avoid the risk of carbon leakage. And we will take those measures if you don't go into the same direction. Perhaps this attitude has also led the Chinese to draw the conclusion that they need to decarbonize in a pace that is comparable to ours.
A question comes in, Frans, on carbon pricing. Do you think creating a separate carbon pricing mechanism, it's quite specific this, but separate carbon pricing mechanism for the transport and building sector is a better approach than bringing those sectors into the ETS in the EU? And if so, when could that realistically be launched?
Well, we're now analysing the pros and cons of bringing those sectors under the ETS system. So we're in the middle of this analysis, and if that is positive, we'll bring them under ETS. Of course, we have to acknowledge that in certain areas, we've also been successful with other measures. In transport, emission norms have been extremely successful. And we will continue to push on emission norms because if you increase the emission norms, you increase the push towards electric mobility or zero emission mobility. And we will continue with that. It's been extremely successful. And we have to wait and see whether ETS can be as successful as increasing emission norms. And I also have to add that in my previous capacity, I was responsible for better regulation. We have to make sure that an ETS system doesn't create a bureaucratic nightmare for businesses and member states. And if you go and look at buildings or transport, you have to be very nitty gritty about things. And I'm not sure we can do this without creating undue administrative pressure.
Yeah, lots of questions coming in now, and I've got to where we are on the time. One final one from me on the carbon pricing. Why is putting a price on carbon more effective in reducing emissions than policy mandates in some sectors?
Well, we have since hundreds of years a price on capital. We have a price on labor. And we've always discounted the price of our economy, the cost of our economy on our natural environment. Putting a price on carbon is actually part of applying economic logic also on the limits of our natural environment. And it will help businesses understand that this is a price element that they need to take into account when they make investment decisions, when they make production decisions. So the beauty of it is that it fits into an economic pricing logic that businesses have been applying for hundreds of years. And that's why I believe, being able to show clearly what the prices of carbon will help businesses and public authorities factor in this price, factor in the pressure on nature, and make that part of the calculation of our economic model.
There's a question on nuclear, Frans. Clearly, a number of countries are planning to completely phase out or reduce the capacity. That's going to be a large share of low carbon power taken off the EU grid. What is the future for nuclear in the sustainable European economy?
Well, the huge advantage of nuclear, obviously, is that it leads to zero emissions. That's a huge advantage. There's a couple of disadvantages as well. It needs primary materials, it needs fuel, and it leads to waste that is very difficult to handle. And the investment needed is huge. And if the price of renewable energy in terms of wind and solar and tides, etc., if that price continues to fall, then of course the comparative advantage of nuclear energy diminishes, because it then becomes prohibitively expensive to have nuclear energy. But that being said, the Commission is technology neutral. If member states decide that they need nuclear energy, they could also decide it not just because of the cost aspect, but for geopolitical reasons. That is up to them. But the only thing I'm saying all the time, nuclear energy, yes, it's zero emission, but it's not sustainable and it's extremely expensive. So please be rational about this, make the calculation, and then take a decision.
And of course, the other part of this is the rather negative perception in Europe towards nuclear.
Well, that depends on where you're coming from.
Yeah.
You know, the perception in Austria and Germany is radically different from the perception in places like France.
Another question: gas is the new coal. Are you committed to ensuring there's no further EU funding to fossil gas infrastructure?
Well, what we're doing, I mean, we have to be very, very clear that for some member states, look at the heating system. Housing is responsible for about 40% of our emissions. If you ask a country like Poland to switch coal off in their heating system, a country that will need heating given the climatological requirements, you cannot expect them immediately to go to purely sustainable energy, to pure wind and solar. That's simply impossible. If in the intermediary you would go to natural gas, already the positive effect on emissions would be huge from coal and wood to natural gas. So in that context, natural gas can be the transitional fuel. If at the same time, building that infrastructure, you front load that infrastructure so that it can afterwards also be used for hydrogen and other zero carbon gases, then you invest into the future. Hydrogen, without any doubt, will be a very important component of Europe's energy mix in the future, decarbonized energy mix in the future. And if your infrastructure is fit for hydrogen, which you can do if you build an infrastructure for natural gas, then you save a lot of money in terms of the investments you need to do afterwards. Just to give you an idea, refitting natural gas infrastructure for hydrogen is about 25% of the cost of creating a completely new infrastructure for hydrogen.
Well, is how much of the cost?
25%.
25%, yeah.
So it's a lot cheaper to refurbish existing, and we have in some countries we have very, very elaborate grids right into households. I mean, my country is an example of that for natural gas.
While I wait just for a few more climate-specific questions to come through, there are a few other bigger bits that I really want to talk to you about, and these are bigger bits because it's rule of law, it's voting rights, etc., etc. And I want to start with voting rights, and this fits very well into this climate discussion. Of course, you know, if the EU is going to become a serious global player on foreign policy, security policy, among other things, it can't really afford to be hamstrung. And I know you've talked about this many times, by a member state withholding support, you know, for a course of action that's necessary. How do we square the circle there? How do you get rid of that unanimity rule while ensuring everyone feels they got a right to a vote?
So in my analysis, what's been paralyzing us as European Union for the last 15 years is what one could call moral hazard. You know, it's a term coming from the financial sector, but moral hazard means that member states are not sure that solidarity will be shown when it is needed. And we saw it in a financial crisis, in the economic crisis, in the migration crisis. There was always a lack of feeling that they see my problem and they want to help me with it. And this has created a lack of trust amongst member states and amongst populations of member states. Our citizens have felt the same way. Now, I think with the agreement on Next Generation EU and the MFF, we saw a paradigm shift in this. I think also many populations look at Italy. The way Europe is perceived after that agreement in Italy is quite different from the way Europe was viewed before that agreement. So if that sort of helps us in a first instance to show that there can be a Europe without everything being dominated by moral hazard, we can then also take it into other areas. And then if you look at foreign policy, we have to get used to the fact that the United States will not be playing the same role the United States played for decades in our security and foreign policy. At the same time, I am hopeful that the United States will not feel the need to continuously try and play one member state of the European Union off against the other, which has been sort of the policy of the Trump administration. I hope that what was a consistent position of the United States over decades and decades, namely that a united Europe is good for the United States, will become the common thinking again in Washington. And I believe we can show that if we're united, given the fact that fundamentally our two societies, European and American societies, share the same values, if we're united, we can really make sure things like the rule of law, democracy, respect for human rights get a stronger voice and get implemented more strongly across the globe.
You mentioned the US, so let me bring that back in. What sort of scenarios planning has the EU done around the US election result? I know Germany's done some. What concerns do you have about a disputed result from either side? What can you tell us?
Well, I think this is something for the American society to sort out. I am, with everything that's happened over the last 4 years, I am still, I've been a transatlanticist all my adult life. I've always dreamt of that city on the hill as something inspiring, and that hasn't changed. In my cultural inspirations, in my love for music in the United States, plays a huge role, and in my affection for that nation is huge. And I honestly believe that regardless of the outcome of the election, there are so many areas where we can continue to cooperate, and we can expand our cooperation. The way we've been working on climate change with corporate America, the way we've been working with academia in the United States, the way we've been working with states and cities. I mean, the Covenant of Mayors, which I co-chair with Mike Bloomberg, has produced a lot of huge and intensive cooperation with parts of the United States, and regardless of the outcome of the elections, this will continue. But obviously, if one candidate doesn't see climate change as a problem, and the other candidate understands that we have a climate crisis on our hands, that makes a difference whether one or the other wins the election.
Yeah. All right. Look, we're running out of time, but back quickly to the rule of law, and we talk often about reining in subversion from within the bloc, the European bloc. This is, I guess, my not so subtle way of talking about Brexit. How great, Frans, are your concerns that Britain becomes a thorn in the EU side from without the bloc in a sort of similar way, and how to deal with that?
Well, of course, we're in the middle of the last part of a very complicated negotiation, and the thing is, if I say things now about how I see the long term, this might be seen as a reflection on what's happening actually today and the weeks to come. I honestly believe that whatever is going to happen in the next couple of days and weeks, we Europeans sometimes in our history are very capable of acting against our best interest in a horrible way. So just to assume that our best interest will bring us closer together is a big assumption. It will need very, very hard work at all levels, in the private sector, in politics, etc. But the bottom line for me is, if we build an acrimonious relationship with the United Kingdom based on we'll get you, or based on our goal is for the Farage line, our goal is for the EU to disappear altogether, or we're going to show you that you can't leave us without being punished. If that is the attitude, we all suffer. We all suffer. We need, Brexit is a reality. It's not going to change anytime soon. We need responsible people need to make the best out of a very bad situation. Everybody suffers in Brexit already now, is my view. Everybody suffers. But we have a responsibility, especially after the pandemic, to limit the harm that's being done to the absolute minimum. We need to protect jobs. We need to protect people's health. We need to protect our society. And going into a fight or an acrimonious relationship between the EU and the United Kingdom will certainly not get us there. Let's not think about short-term political gains or losses. Let's think about the interest of our societies, for heaven's sake.
And with that in mind, well, do you think both? And I've got to ask you this: do you think both sides will come to their senses and we'll get a trade deal?
Well, the only thing I can do is plead for this.
Are you optimistic?
I cannot. I have to say very, very strongly that I refute any suggestion that the European Union would be negotiating in bad faith or not compromising, etc. I've been part of this for the last 4.5 years. I have seen what the previous commission has done, what this commission is doing. I am in full admiration of what Michel Barnier has done and is doing. He is acting in good faith in the interest of all parties. And the attacks he's had to undergo from different sides are highly unfair. It left him completely unfazed. He's completely focused on the issue at hand. We, the European Union, want a deal on this. We want to come out of this in a good way. But we cannot sacrifice fundamental issues of the internal market, of regulation, just for the expediency of having a deal. This should be well understood in London.
Final question, Frans, just again, stepping back and stepping to the sort of the premise of this discussion. There are those, I think this is probably the question I ask most of people right now, policy and business. Is this what we're going through now an opportunity to change for the better, or do we see this as an excuse to regress and pull back and be a little bit more cautious? What are you seeing and feeling as someone who sits right at the center in Europe? What are you seeing from your partners, the people you work with, the businesses you speak to? What's the general sense you're getting?
Well, what makes me optimistic is that there is no contention anywhere that we're living through times of tectonic change. Our societies are going through fundamental change, and that we need to steer that change and organize that change to avoid the worst and to create the opportunities we need as societies so that we don't take leave of our values and that we leave no one behind. There is a strong understanding across the board, private sector, financial sector, politics, society, and you also see that people take courage from the fact that in the situation we are in now, it leads to the weakening of populist politics and extremist politics. So the center takes courage from this. I see this everywhere. But it's also an opportunity that can be wasted if we don't act very quickly and very decisively and jointly as Europeans. So I think we have a huge opportunity. We could, to say it in blunt terms, we could screw this up in a terrible way, but we could also make this a success for our society and bring back a bit of optimism if we show that we will leave no one behind. It's a huge opportunity, but it's going to be bloody difficult to get there, and we could stumble and fall if we're not very careful.
Yeah. All right. Look, Frans, I want to thank you for your time and your candor speaking with us at Reuters today. I very much enjoyed that. Thank you as well to everyone who sent through their questions. That is always extremely useful and shows us just how engaged everyone out there is as well. Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans, thanks very much indeed for talking with us.
It was my pleasure. Stay safe.
You too.